Hi everyone. Today we are going to discuss nonparametric machine learning methods. In this part, we will study nonparametric unsupervised density estimation, and in the second part, we will continue with learning about nonparametric, supervised, classification and regression problems. As we already discussed, in supervised learning problems, we are given a data set where each instance consists of x-y pairs, and the goal is to predict the label y from input x. Classification and regression problems are two special cases of supervised learning problems. In unsupervised learning, the data set doesn't contain label y's. The goal is to simply do something with the input features, for example, cluster the data points in a meaningful way, or estimate the unknown density function of the dataset. During the earlier lectures, we already covered some parametric methods. Parametric methods assume some kind of parametric distributional form for the dataset. For example, in naive Bayes methods, we assumed that px given y and py has a parametric distribution, such as Gaussian or Bernoulli. In logistic regression, we assumed an explicit parametric form for py given x. In linear and polynomial regression, we try to find the best parameters for the model to predict the labels of the unknown test points. Similarly, in neural networks, we also assume that label y can be predicted from input x using a neural network with some optimally trained parameters. In these models, we just need to estimate the finite many parameters of the model, for example the weight of the neural network, and plug them into the model that we can now use for prediction. Parametric methods are popular because usually they need fewer training data points to learn these parameters, and often can get a better model than nonparametric methods. However, often these parametric assumptions are too strong and not satisfied in practice. Then these parametric models cannot provide a good model for the data. In contrast to parametric models, nonparametric methods don't make any parametric distributional assumptions about the data. As we have more training data, these models can learn more complex models. Often, we can actually think of nonparametric models as parametric ones, where the number of parameters scale with the number of training data. In parametric models, we assume that there are only a finite number of parameters that don't depend on the number of instances in the training data. In part 1, we will discuss some unsupervised nonparametric methods for density estimation, and in part 2, we will discuss supervised nonparametric methods for classification and regression. After this short introduction, we are ready to start learning about density estimation problems. Given a data set whose elements are sampled IID, that is in an independent and identically distributed way, in density estimation problem, we want to answer questions such as how likely it is for a new data point to appear at a specific location, or more formally, what is the density of the data set at any specific locations. I'm trying to visualize this density estimation problem here with this figure. Our training data set consists of these blue points, and we need to estimate its density function at any location. The true density is visualized with the contour map of the density function. The contour map consists of contour lines, and on each contour line, the density function has a constant value, so that the curve joins points of equal values. Sometimes, the contour lines are also called isolines. First, let's quickly review how to estimate densities with parametric methods. In parametric methods, you assume that your dataset is sampled from a parametric distribution, for example, a Gaussian distribution with parameter mean mu and variance sigma squared. The density of this Gaussian distribution is defined by this expression. We assume we have n data points sampled from this density. They are indicated by these blue circles and denoted by x1, x2, and so on, xn. Then the parameters mu and sigma squared can be estimated with maximum likelihood estimation. That is, we have to find that mean mu and standard deviation sigma, which maximizes this likelihood function. It's easy to prove that the estimated mean mu hat that maximizes the likelihood function is just the sample average shown here. We can also prove that the estimated variance sigma squared is this expression here. This maximum likelihood estimation is very simple, but often it can provide very bad results. Imagine, for example, that our data set consists of these yellow points. They represent student scores on a test. To be able to better visualize this data, I'm also showing its histogram, where each bin has the same length, 5. As you can see, if we simply fit a Gaussian to this data set, shown by the purple curve, then the results look quite bad. Our data set has 2 modes, but the Gaussian distribution only has 1 mode, so the fit is far from perfect. To get better results, we could try to fit a more complex parametric model, for example a mixture of a few Gaussians, but that might not provide the best results either. An alternative approach is to use nonparametric methods, where we do not assume that the dataset was sampled from a parametric distribution. We will discuss a few important nonparametric density estimation methods now. The first nonparametric density estimator that we will study is the histogram density estimator. In the histogram density estimator, no surprise, we will create histograms. Here is a one-dimensional dataset. To be able to visualize it, I perturbed the coordinates randomly along the y-axis. But again, the dataset is just one-dimensional. To create a histogram, we partition the x-axis into some bins and count how many points belong to each bin. We could do the same thing with multidimensional datasets as well. For example, here is a two-dimensional dataset. We partition the two-dimensional space into two-dimensional boxes or bins and count how many points belong to each two-dimensional bin. We can visualize the results with these two-dimensional histograms. We will use histograms to create a density estimator. Here, I'm showing how to estimate densities with histograms in one dimension, but we could use very similar methods in higher dimension as well. We assume we have a data set sampled IID from the density P. First, we partition the data space into distinct bins. Let the width of bin I be denoted with delta I. Then we count how many points from the data set belong to each bin. Let Ni denote how many points are in bin I. So the histogram is just a bar plot with heights n1, n2, n3, and so on. The estimated density of the distribution of the data points at location x is denoted by p hat x, and it is defined by this expression. If point x belongs to bin I, then the estimated density at location x is just ni divided by n times delta I. Here again, delta I is just the width of bin I. Often, we use the same width for all bins, that is delta I equals delta for all I and for some parameter delta. This is indeed a nonparametric estimator in a sense that we do not make any parametric assumptions about the density P of the data. The method, however, has one parameter delta, and we might wonder what happens when we change the value of delta. I'm showing you some results here. The green curve shows the true density. We want our histogram estimate to be as close to this as possible. Our histogram estimate is shown with these blue bars. When delta is very small, then we have lots of bins, and the histogram estimator can wiggle a lot. Because of this, it might not be a good fit. When delta is bigger, then our estimator is better. However, when delta is too big, then the histogram estimate is too smooth, it cannot change quickly, and as a result of this, the fit can be worse again. So it seems there's an optimal delta for histogram density estimation. If you only want to know what a histogram density estimator is, then we can stop here, since we just defined the estimator. But you might still have some reasonable and important questions. For example, why does this estimator make sense at all? We understand someone defined the estimator this way, but why? How good is this estimator? How big is the variance of the estimator? How big is the bias of the estimator? How does the bias and the variance depend on the parameter delta? How quickly does the error of this estimator decreases as we increase the sample size n? We will try to look at some of these questions now. The first question is, why does this estimate make sense? Why is this estimator defined this way? We can answer this question if we think of the definition of the density function. Let x be a fixed point inside of a bin with length delta. Let's denote this bin with bin x delta. From the definition of density, we know that density P at location x can be defined as this limit. The probability that x belongs to this bin divided by delta, where delta converges to 0. If the green curve is the density, and these red brackets indicate the bin of point x, then we know that the area under this density curve in this bin is exactly the probability that the random point x belongs to this bin. What we do in this histogram estimator is that we try to estimate this probability using our data. If x is in bin I and ni points belong to this bin from our training data, then we can estimate this probability as ni over n if we have n points in the training data. So we replace this probability with ni over n, and then we get p hat, the histogram density estimator. Now we know the motivation why the density estimator was defined this way. You might also ask the question, how biased this estimator is? That is, how far is the expected value of this estimator, p hat, from the true density p? Let's try to calculate it. To simplify our notation, let's assume the density p is defined on the interval 0 and 1. If the bin size is delta, then the number of bins is 1 over delta. As we discussed earlier, the histogram density estimator, p hat, was defined by this expression. We can rewrite p hat into this form. This form is useful because it helps us calculate the expected value of p hat. The expected value of p hat is just this quantity here. This term is the expected value of how many points are in bin X. This is just the probability of being in bin X. We can rewrite this probability with the density function, since the probability is just the integral of the density. Now, if the bin width delta is small and px is continuous, it means that p cannot change much in the bin. It's almost constant in the bin, and therefore its integral is just px times delta. So we get that the expected value of the estimated density p hat x is close to the true density px, so the bias of the density estimator is small if delta is small. Similarly, we can see that if delta is large, then px can change a lot in the bin, and therefore its integral can be far from px times delta, so the bias of the estimator can be large. As we discussed, the bias measures how far the expected value of p hat x is from px. Even if the bias is small, the estimator can be still bad if its variance is high. The variance measures how much p hat can deviate from its expected value. A good estimator has to have small bias and small variance as well. We know so far that if delta is small, then the bias is small. We also know that in this case, the number of bins is high because the number of bins is just 1 over delta. Since the number of bins is high if we keep the number of points n fixed, therefore there are fewer points in the bins, so we get unstable estimates in the bins. In this case, for another set of training data, the estimate could be different in the bins. Therefore, the variance of the estimator is large in this case. On the other hand, when delta is large, we know that the bias is large as well. Since the number of bins is just 1 over delta, when delta is large, we have fewer bins, so the probability estimate in the bins is more stable, and therefore, for another set of training data, the probability estimates would be similar. That is, the expected value of p hat is about the same as p hat, so the variance of the estimator is smaller. To summarize, when delta is small, then the number of bins is large, the bias of the estimator is small, and its variance is large. On the other hand, when delta is large, then the number of bins is small, the bias of the estimator is large, and its variance is small. We call this the bias-variance trade-off. In this concrete example, I show how the mean squared error of the estimator changes as we increase the number of bins. The mean squared error is just the squared bias plus the variance of the estimator. As you can see, as we increase the number of bins, for a while the mean squared error is decreasing, but after it achieved its optimal value, it starts increasing again. Now that we finished the discussion of histogram-based density estimators, we will study another family of density estimators called kernel density estimators, or KDE. These density estimators are very simple. We just place small bumps at each of the n data points. These bumps are determined by a kernel function. They are simple non-negative functions such that the area under each bump is 1 over n. The density estimator will be simply the sum of these bumps, so that it's a non-negative function, and its cumulative area under the curve is 1, so it's a density function. You can see the visualization of this approach here. We have 6 data points from minus 2.1 to 6.2. We placed these bump functions at each location. Those are the dashed curves. When we add them, we get the blue curve, which is the estimated density. Note that where the points are denser, the density estimate has higher values. To be a bit more formal, the kernel function or bump function can be any function k, such that k is non-negative and its integral on the whole domain is 1. Two popular kernel functions are the box kernel, also known as boxcar kernel, and the Gaussian kernel. You can see them here. The box kernel is simply 1/2 in the region of -1, 1 and 0 otherwise. You can check it's indeed a non-negative function and its integral is 1 from -1 to 1. The Gaussian kernel is simply the density of the standard normal distribution. These kernels have a bandwidth parameter delta, which can simply squeeze or stretch these bump functions. When we place these kernel functions on a data point xj, then the transformed functions are k xj minus x over delta. The kernel density estimate is defined by this expression. It's just the sum of these bump functions placed around points xj, where j is going from 1 to n. We need to multiply this with 1 over delta, because when we stretch these kernel functions with bandwidth parameter delta, its integral changed to delta from 1, so we need to normalize it back to get a density function with integral 1. As you can see, the kernel density estimate provides a valid estimated density. You might wonder how the quality of the density estimator changes with the bandwidth parameter delta. The story is very similar to what we have seen with histogram density estimators. If the parameter delta is too small, then the estimated function might be undersmoothed. If it's too large, then it might be oversmoothed. So there's an optimal parameter that ideally we should find, but its value depends on the unknown density function. Here, I'm comparing the histogram and kernel-based density estimators. The green function is the true density. As you can see, as we increase delta, first, the estimated functions are undersmoothed, then at some point they become just right, and when we increase delta even further, they become oversmoothed. The next family of density estimators that I would like to discuss with you is called k nearest neighbor density estimators, or KNN density estimators. It is a very simple density estimator. Assume again that we are given a data set sampled IID from a distribution with density p. These sample points are illustrated with these red circles. First, we fix a positive integer k, for example k equals 4 in this example. Let x denote a point where we want to estimate the density. It is this blue circle in this example. We select the k nearest neighbors of x. K was set to be 4 in this example. This black circle shows the smallest circle around x that contains these 4 points. Let delta kx denote the volume of this ball. The KNN density estimator is simply this expression, k over n times delta kx. As you can see, it's a very simple estimator, and it's very easy to try and test in applications. If you only want to know what the KNN density estimator is, then we can stop here since we just defined the estimator. But you might still have some questions. For example, why does this estimator make sense at all? What happens to the error of the estimator when we change k? How large k should be to get a good estimator? Let's try to answer some of these questions now. As we just discussed, the KNN density estimator is defined by this expression. Let x be a random variable with density p. Let lowercase x be a fixed point where we want to estimate the density p using our data. Let vol bx epsilon denote the volume of a ball with radius epsilon. Let epsilon kx denote the distance from x to its k's nearest neighbor. From the definition of density, for small epsilon, we have that px is approximately the probability that the random variable x is in the ball around x with radius epsilon divided by the volume of this ball. By definition, delta kx is the volume of the ball around x with radius epsilon kx. We know that k out of n points are in this ball. So we estimate this probability with k over n. This way we can see that it makes sense to estimate px with p hat x, which is just k divided by n times delta kx. Let's think again of the histogram density estimator. There we fixed the bins and the size of the bin delta and estimated the probability with the number of points in the bin of x. That was the quantity ni. Here, however, in the knn density estimator, if we fix k as a function of n, but there's no fixed size bin around x, we consider the ball around x that contains k training points, and we used delta, the volume of this ball, in the estimator, but this delta is not fixed. It's a random quantity that depends on the data. Before we finish the discussion of density estimators, I want to warn you that density estimation is very difficult in high dimensions. We will need to have a sufficient supply of data to get meaningful nonparametric density estimates. Typically, we need exponentially more data points as we increase the dimension. This is the curse of dimensionality. To summarize, density estimators provide means of estimating the likelihood of occurrence of a given data point based on a collection of training data. We discussed a parametric method with maximum likelihood estimation, and we also discussed 3 nonparametric approaches: the histogram, the kernel density, and the k nearest neighbor density estimation. Thanks for your attention.